The morning sun cast long shadows across the tarmac at Riverside Regional Airport as Chief Mechanic Mike Torres wiped his greasy hands on an already dirty rag. The UH-60 Black Hawk helicopter sat motionless on the landing pad, its rotor blades drooping like the wings of a wounded bird. What should have been a routine maintenance check had turned into the most frustrating week of his 15-year career. "This doesn't make any sense," Mike muttered to his team of 6 mechanics gathered around the aircraft. "We've replaced the transmission 3 times, rebuilt the engine twice, and still getting that grinding noise every time we try to start her up." The helicopter belonged to the state's emergency medical service, a critical piece of equipment that had saved hundreds of lives over the past decade. Now it sat grounded, useless, while people in remote areas went without the rapid medical transport they desperately needed. The pressure was mounting from the hospital administration, the state government, and, most importantly, from the families who depended on this service. Jake Morrison, the youngest member of the team at 24, scratched his head as he stared at the engine compartment. "Maybe we're missing something obvious. Sometimes the simplest problems look the most complicated." "We've been through every system twice," replied Sarah Chun, the team's avionics specialist. "The computer diagnostics aren't showing anything unusual. Everything reads normal on paper, but when we fire her up, that grinding sound is like nails on a chalkboard." The team had worked 16-hour days for the past week, pulling apart systems they had put back together just hours before. Coffee cups and energy drink cans littered their workstation. Dark circles under their eyes told the story of sleepless nights spent poring over technical manuals and calling manufacturers for advice. Mike's radio crackled to life. "Torres, this is Control. Any update on the Black Hawk? We've got 3 emergency calls on hold, and the backup helicopter is still in Portland for its annual inspection." He pressed the radio button with more force than necessary. "Still working on it, Control. Give us another hour." But Mike knew an hour wouldn't be enough. They had tried everything in the book and several things that weren't. The manufacturer's technical support team had been stumped when they described the problem over the phone. Even the company's senior engineer, who had designed parts of this specific model, couldn't offer any new suggestions. "Maybe we should call it," said Tommy Rodriguez, a mechanic with 12 years of experience. "Sometimes you have to know when you're beat. We could recommend they send it back to the factory." The words hung in the air like a confession of defeat. Sending the helicopter back to the manufacturer would mean weeks, possibly months, without this vital emergency service. It would also mean admitting that their team, which had built a reputation for solving impossible problems, had finally met their match. Mike looked around at his crew, seeing his own frustration reflected in their faces. These weren't inexperienced mechanics fresh out of school. Sarah had worked on military aircraft for 8 years before joining their civilian team. Tommy had trained at Boeing and worked on everything from small private planes to massive cargo aircraft. Jake might be young, but he had an intuitive understanding of mechanical systems that couldn't be taught. "Let's take a break," Mike finally said. "Step away from this thing for an hour. Sometimes fresh eyes see what tired ones miss." As the team dispersed to grab lunch or catch a few minutes of rest, Mike remained by the helicopter. He ran his hand along the aircraft's sleek black surface, feeling the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. This wasn't just about mechanical failure. It was about the trust the community had placed in him and his team. The helicopter had been in service for 8 years without any major problems. It had flown through thunderstorms to reach accident victims, landed in impossible conditions to evacuate critically injured patients, and had never once failed to complete a mission when lives were on the line. Now, for reasons nobody could understand, it refused to cooperate. Mike's phone buzzed with a text message from his wife. "Hospital called. They want to know if you need any help. Apparently, there's an old guy hanging around the cafeteria asking about the helicopter problem." He almost deleted the message without responding. The last thing he needed was some curious bystander offering unsolicited advice. But something made him pause. Maybe it was desperation, or maybe it was the memory of his grandfather, who always said that wisdom often came from unexpected sources. The hospital cafeteria was nearly empty at 2 in the afternoon. Mike spotted the old man immediately, sitting alone at a corner table with a cup of coffee and what looked like a technical manual. He was probably in his 70s, with silver hair and weathered hands that spoke of decades of hard work. His clothes were clean, but old-fashioned, and he had the careful posture of someone who had spent years working with precision equipment. "Excuse me," Mike said, approaching the table. "I'm Mike Torres, chief mechanic for the medical helicopter. I heard you were asking about our situation." The old man looked up with surprisingly sharp blue eyes. "Frank Sullivan," he said, extending a calloused hand. "Retired Army mechanic. Worked on helicopters for 36 years, including Black Hawks like the one giving you trouble." Mike felt a flicker of interest, despite his skepticism. "What makes you think you know what our problem is?" Frank smiled, a knowing expression that reminded Mike of his grandfather. "Because I've heard that exact grinding sound before. It's not in any manual, and most mechanics never encounter it in their entire careers. But when you do, you never forget it. Our team has been through every system," Mike explained. "We've got 15 years of combined experience with these aircraft, plus manufacturer support. If there was an obvious solution, we would have found it." "Sometimes the obvious solution isn't in the manual," Frank replied quietly. "Sometimes it's in the stories the old-timers tell, the problems that happened once or twice and got filed away in someone's memory instead of in the official records." Mike found himself sitting down across from Frank, drawn by the man's calm confidence. "What kind of stories?" Frank leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a conversational tone. "Ever hear of sympathetic vibration? It's when one part of a machine starts vibrating in harmony with another part, creating a resonance that can tear equipment apart if you don't know how to stop it." "We checked for vibration issues," Mike said. "Everything came back normal." "You checked the obvious places," Frank nodded. "But there's one spot that doesn't show up on standard diagnostics. It's in the connection between the main gearbox and the tail rotor drive shaft. There's a small damper there about the size of a soda can that's designed to prevent exactly this kind of sympathetic vibration." Mike's interest sharpened. "Our diagnostics would have caught a faulty damper. Not if it's failing in a very specific way," Frank explained. "If the rubber inside the damper starts to separate from the metal housing, it can create a grinding sound that comes and goes based on temperature and humidity. The computer diagnostics read it as normal because technically the damper is still connected and functioning, but it's not doing its job properly." The explanation made more sense than anything Mike had heard all week. It would explain why the grinding sounds seemed to vary from day to day and why their diagnostics couldn't pinpoint the source of the problem. "Why would you know about this if it's not in the manuals?" Mike asked. Frank's expression grew distant, as if he were remembering something from long ago. "Because I was part of the team that discovered this problem back in 1987. We had 3 Black Hawks developing the same mysterious grinding sound within 6 months of each other. Took us 4 months to figure it out, and by then, one of the aircraft had suffered a complete tail rotor failure during a training mission." "What happened to the crew?" Mike asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know. "They got lucky," Frank said. "Experienced pilot managed an emergency landing with only minor injuries. But it could have been much worse. After that, the Army quietly modified the damper design and issued new maintenance procedures. But those procedures were classified for years, and I don't think they ever made it into the civilian maintenance manuals." Mike felt a surge of hope for the first time in days. "Would you be willing to take a look at our helicopter? I mean, if you're right about this, you might have just solved our problem." Frank nodded slowly. "I'd be honored to help. But I should warn you, if I'm right about this, the repair isn't going to be simple. That damper isn't designed to be replaced in the field. We'll have to improvise." As they walked back toward the helicopter, Mike found himself reassessing his assumptions about who could provide valuable help. Frank moved with the careful precision of someone who had spent decades working around dangerous machinery, and his questions about the helicopter's recent service history showed a deep understanding of how these complex machines operated. The rest of Mike's team was already back at work when they arrived at the landing pad. Sarah looked up from her diagnostic computer with raised eyebrows when she saw Mike approaching with a stranger. "Everyone, this is Frank Sullivan," Mike announced. "He's a retired Army helicopter mechanic who thinks he might know what's causing our problem." The team exchanged glances. Mike could read their thoughts easily enough. They had been working on this problem for a week, using the most advanced diagnostic equipment available. Now, their boss was bringing in some random old guy who probably hadn't worked on a helicopter in years. Jake was the first to speak up. "No offense, sir, but we've been pretty thorough. If there was something obvious, we would have found it by now." Frank nodded respectfully. "I understand your skepticism, son. You're right to be cautious about outside advice. But sometimes experience trumps technology, especially when you're dealing with a problem that's not supposed to exist." Tommy crossed his arms. "What kind of problem isn't supposed to exist?" "The kind that happens so rarely that it never makes it into the official maintenance procedures," Frank explained. "The kind that gets fixed once or twice, filed away in someone's memory, and forgotten until it happens again 20 years later." Sarah saved her diagnostic data and turned to face Frank directly. "All right, let's say you're correct about this mystery problem. What exactly are you suggesting we look for?" Frank pointed toward the helicopter's tail boom. "There's a vibration damper in the tail rotor drive system that's probably failing in a way your instruments can't detect. If I'm right, we should be able to confirm it with a simple physical inspection." "We've inspected that system multiple times," Mike said, though his tone was more curious than dismissive. "You've inspected it for obvious damage," Frank corrected. "But this kind of failure is subtle. You have to know exactly what you're looking for, and you have to check it under the right conditions." The team followed Frank as he approached the helicopter's tail section. He moved slowly, running his hands along various components with the careful attention of someone reading a language written in metal and moving parts. "Here," he said, stopping at a cylindrical component about halfway down the tail boom. "This is the damper I'm talking about. From the outside, it probably looks perfectly normal. But if you remove it and examine the interior, I think you'll find that the rubber isolation material has started to separate from the metal housing." Mike knelt down to examine the component Frank had indicated. It was exactly as Frank had described, a cylindrical damper about the size of a soda can, designed to absorb vibrations from the tail rotor drive system. To his experienced eye, it looked completely normal. "This looks fine," he said. "No cracks, no obvious wear, no loose connections." "The problem is inside," Frank explained. "The rubber that's supposed to isolate the vibrations starts to deteriorate after years of service, but it does so in a way that's not